Let's be honest. You've spent way too much of your life waiting for people to finally get you. You explain yourself, then explain again, then rephrase it, then make it simpler, then wonder what you're doing wrong. But here's the twist. The problem was never that people don't understand you. It's that you keep trying to convince the wrong audience. And before you click away, here's the part you've probably never considered. Carl Jung once pointed out that the most important parts of who you are develop inside you, not through the approval of others, which means you might be wasting your time trying to translate something that was never meant to be universally understood. So let's break this down. Let's start with something familiar. You've had those moments where you're trying to explain why you made a certain choice, maybe why you took a different path, switched a routine, changed your style, adjusted your priorities, or simply said no to something you used to say yes to. And instead of somebody understanding, they look at you like you're overthinking, being dramatic, or making it more complicated than it needs to be. So you try again and again, rephrasing the same thought 5 different ways, hoping one version finally lands. Maybe you've even softened your tone just to make the explanation easier to digest, or shortened it so it doesn't seem like a big deal, or added extra context you didn't even want to share, just to earn a little more clarity from someone who's barely trying to meet you halfway. And each time they still don't get it, you start wondering if maybe you're the problem. Maybe you're not explaining it well. Maybe you need the right sentence, the perfect angle, a smarter way to break it down. That's the loop. That's the trap. The more you try to prove who you are, the less you feel like you actually are who you're trying to explain. It's like constantly handing people a map of a city you built, the streets, the shortcuts, the whole layout, and watching them still take wrong turns. Not because the map is bad, not because you didn't give enough detail, but because they're not familiar with the territory in the first place. And here's the cliffhanger that hits hardest. What if these people were never misunderstanding you in the way you think? What if they're simply not equipped to interpret the inner world you're trying so hard to translate? That's the real turning point. And it's the doorway into understanding why waiting for people to get you is a guaranteed way to stall your entire life. Jung had this simple but uncomfortable idea. Every person carries their own internal framework, their own patterns, meanings, motives, fears, strengths, reactions, and reasoning. In other words, the inside of your mind isn't a public building. It's more like a layout only you can navigate. Think about how this shows up in your day-to-day life. Maybe you like doing things in a very specific order because it helps you stay focused. Someone else sees that and thinks you're being rigid. Maybe you pull back when you're processing something serious. They interpret it as you being cold or distant. Maybe you're careful with what you commit to because you've learned that your energy isn't unlimited. They assume you're being dramatic, lazy, or avoiding effort. Or maybe you simply don't jump into new things as fast as the people around you. To them, you're hesitant. To you, you're just being thorough. Same action, completely different interpretation. Because they're using their framework to judge your decisions, not yours. Jung understood this disconnect deeply. He believed each person has their own psychological blueprint, and no 2 blueprints match, which means no one can fully decode your choices, your pace, your reactions, or the way you see the world. And here's the twist. This isn't a flaw. It's the whole point. If everyone operates with a different framework, then expecting everyone to understand you is like expecting someone to instantly read a code book they've never seen. They're not wrong for not understanding you. They're just interpreting your world through instructions written for a completely different system. That's why waiting for understanding keeps failing. Not because you're unclear, but because you're speaking a language only you were built to speak fluently. And this leads right into the real breakthrough. What if the goal isn't to be universally understood at all? What if the real power comes from something else entirely? Here's the part that feels uncomfortable at first, but becomes freeing once it clicks. If everyone sees the world through a different lens, then you don't need universal understanding. You just need alignment with yourself. Think about how often you've slowed yourself down, not because something was unclear to you, but because you were worried it wouldn't make sense to someone else. Maybe you had an idea you were excited about, but you paused because you knew you'd have to explain why it mattered, and you could already picture the blank stare you'd get back. Maybe you wanted to change your routine, start something new, or cut out something that wasn't working. But you hesitated because you knew the questions were coming. Why now? What changed? What's the point? And suddenly you're spending more time preparing answers for people who aren't even living the consequences of your choices than actually taking the step you already knew was right. That's the cost of waiting to be understood. Your clarity gets delayed. Your timing gets disrupted. Your priorities get rearranged to fit someone else's level of comprehension. But here's the twist you weren't told. The people around you don't have to understand your decisions for them to be the right decisions. Clarity doesn't need a crowd. Understanding doesn't need unanimous votes. You don't need everyone to get why you operate the way you do. You just need to know why you do it. Because something strange happens the moment you stop chasing universal approval. Your movements get faster. Your choices get sharper. Your direction becomes obvious, even if you don't narrate it to anyone. You stop trimming your thoughts down to something easily digestible. You stop rewriting your motives to avoid being questioned. You stop shrinking your perspective so it fits inside someone else's mental limits. And here's the cliffhanger. When you stop trying to convince people, you stop diluting your own reasons. And that changes everything about how you show up next. There's a very specific kind of energy you lose when you're constantly trying to be understood. And you usually don't notice it until you stop handing it out. Think about the last time you tried to explain a decision that already made perfect sense to you. Maybe you had a plan that felt right, but you paused to make it make sense to someone who wasn't even part of the situation. By the time you finished explaining, you weren't even sure if your original thought was solid anymore. That's the hidden cost. Clarity drains when you keep pouring it into explanations for people who don't have the context to appreciate it. But when you stop doing that, you get that clarity back. You get back the mental space you didn't realize you were renting out to other people's confusion. Suddenly, you think faster, you decide quicker, you second-guess yourself less. Instead of trimming your thoughts down into something easy, you let them stay complex, layered, and accurate, because they're for you, not for someone who needs everything simplified. It's like this. You stop pausing mid-idea to think, how do I word this so they won't question it? You stop reordering your decisions to avoid someone else's confusion. You stop running your thoughts through an imaginary approval filter before you act on them. And here's the shift most people don't expect. When you stop explaining yourself, your actions get louder. Not in a showy way, in a clean, straightforward way. You start moving because it's the right move, not because it's explainable. You start choosing things that feel aligned, not things that look understandable to the outside world. The power you get back isn't about being rebellious. It's about reclaiming the mental bandwidth you've been leaking through unnecessary explanations. And here's the cliffhanger. There's something even deeper underneath this shift, something that hits your identity in a way you don't see coming until it happens. Here's the part that catches people off guard. Most of the explaining you've been doing isn't actually about clarity. It's about doubt. Your doubt, disguised as just making sure they understand. Let's be real. There have been times when you knew exactly why you made a choice, But the moment someone raised an eyebrow, your confidence dipped just a little. Not because the choice was wrong, but because you weren't fully settled inside yourself yet. So you explained. Not to inform them, but to steady yourself. For example, maybe you changed your schedule, or stepped away from something that wasn't working, or decided to put your time into something different. Then someone questioned it, casually, and suddenly you found yourself giving a full breakdown, like you were presenting a report you never planned to write. Or maybe you simply preferred doing something in a way that wasn't common in your circle. And instead of just owning it, you felt the need to justify it, so nobody labeled it weird. This is what Jung would point to as the quiet tension between your inner direction and the outside world. You feel pulled to move one way, but the moment someone doesn't immediately understand, you hesitate. As if their confusion is a sign that you need to rethink everything. But here's the turning point. When you stop waiting for people to understand you, you stop negotiating who you are. You stop treating your intentions like they're up for debate. You stop asking for reassurance through explanations. You stop thinking you owe people a walkthrough of your motives every time you shift direction. And here's the part that hits deep. Your confidence doesn't grow when people finally understand you. It grows when you stop needing them to. That's the identity flip. The moment your sense of direction comes from inside, not from the reactions outside. Because when you no longer rely on being understood to feel steady, your choices become something you stand on, not something you defend. And this is where an even bigger internal shift starts to happen. Once you stop needing other people to get you before you move, your internal world starts shifting in ways you don't expect, quietly at first, then all at once. You start trusting your own decisions more, almost accidentally. Not because you suddenly became wiser overnight, but because you're no longer diluting your thinking by running it through a dozen imaginary conversations. For example, you might notice you stop rehearsing explanations in your head. You're not planning how to justify your next decision before you even make it. You're not mentally preparing for someone to question your timing, your approach, or your reasoning. You just think and act. You might also notice you don't second-guess yourself as much. You don't pause mid-thought wondering, will this make sense to them? Because them stops being part of the equation unless the situation actually requires it. Even simple decisions hit differently. You pick things because they're right for you, not because they're easy to explain. You stop choosing the safe option just to avoid being misunderstood. You stop doing things in the most predictable way just to dodge questions or opinions. Your boundaries get clearer without you having to announce them. Your preferences sharpen without you needing to justify them. Your pace becomes something you set internally instead of syncing it to whoever's watching. And here's what's really happening under the surface. Every time you choose clarity over explanation, you're teaching your mind that your reasoning is enough, that your perspective is solid, that your voice has weight even when nobody else echoes it. That internal reinforcement builds something you can't get from any external understanding: self-trust. And that self-trust leads straight into one of the most unexpected outcomes of this entire shift. Here's the irony nobody tells you. The moment you stop trying to make everyone understand you, you actually become clearer. Not because you're explaining more, but because you're finally acting from a place that isn't watered down. Think about how this plays out. When you're constantly explaining yourself, you end up adjusting your tone, trimming your ideas, softening your decisions, or reshuffling your priorities just to avoid confusing someone. Your actions become this blurry mix of what you want and what you think others can handle. But when you stop doing that, your choices get sharper. If you decide to change your routine, you change it, without announcing it like a formal update. If you shift your priorities, you shift them, without apologizing for the rearrangement. If you move in a new direction, you move, without explaining the entire backstory behind the choice. And people notice the difference. They may not understand every detail behind what you're doing, but they can see the consistency. They can see the alignment. They can see the follow-through. That clarity in your actions makes you easier to read for the right audience. The people who pay attention to patterns, not explanations. These are the people who'll pick up on your direction without needing a step-by-step walkthrough. They'll understand your pace without you having to slow down. They'll recognize your intention because your choices aren't being edited for mass comprehension anymore. You stop looking unpredictable or confusing because you're no longer switching gears every time someone raises a question. You're simply following your own internal logic, the same logic they can observe in how you carry yourself. And here's the twist. The people who never understood you in the first place, they'll still be confused, but their confusion stops mattering because you're not performing for it anymore. And this leads straight into the final, most important shift, the one misunderstanding that actually does matter. Here's the kicker most people completely miss. The only misunderstanding that really matters isn't with anyone else. It's the one between you and yourself. Think about it. How many times have you hesitated, over-explained, or second-guessed yourself? Not because someone else didn't understand, but because you weren't fully clear on what you wanted, why you were doing it, or what it meant for you. Maybe you made a choice and instantly started questioning it. Am I doing this for the right reasons? Or maybe you paused a step because you weren't entirely sure it aligned with what you actually value. Or maybe you've adjusted your words and actions to match what you think others expect, instead of what feels right to you. That's the misunderstanding that matters. Not anyone else's misinterpretation, your own. Jung was clear about this. Internal conflicts and hidden motives are what create most of the friction in life. If you can't see your own patterns, trust your own reasoning, or define your own direction, no amount of external understanding will fix it. Once you get clear with yourself, everything else falls into perspective. The people who never understood you? That's background noise. The opinions that used to weigh you down. Suddenly irrelevant. The need to over-explain or justify? Gone. Internal clarity becomes your anchor. Your decisions stop being reactions to others' perceptions. Your direction becomes your own, not something you adjust based on who's paying attention. And this brings us home. Here's something most people don't notice until it actually happens. The moment you stop trying to explain yourself, momentum starts working in your favor. Think about how much energy you used to waste framing your actions for others. Every decision required a mini presentation in your head, a justification, a defense, a backstory, before you even moved. That's mental friction. That's slow motion. That's momentum buried under other people's expectations. Now imagine dropping all of that. You make a choice. You act. You adjust only based on results, not reactions. You stop spinning your wheels to make someone else see your logic. And suddenly, things start moving faster than before. Maybe you notice you finish projects quicker because you're no longer rewriting them in real time to make them digestible. Maybe you start tackling ideas you would have shelved simply because they seemed like they'd be hard to explain. Maybe you stop overthinking every small interaction and the cumulative energy saved feels like a superpower. Here's the truth. Waiting for anyone to understand you before you act is a guaranteed way to stall your life. You've already seen it. You over-explain, you pause, you doubt yourself. All for people who aren't even built to see your full blueprint. And all that energy? It disappears. But when you stop, everything changes. You make your choices, you take your steps, you set your direction. People will catch up later, or they won't. And honestly, it doesn't matter. Because the only understanding that truly counts is your own. Your clarity, your trust, your alignment. That's what moves the needle. So here's the challenge. Stop pausing for permission. Stop pausing for agreement. Stop pausing for nods, understanding, or explanations that may never come. Move first. Trust yourself. Let understanding be optional, and watch how everything else falls into place. Because the life you're meant to lead isn't held hostage by anyone else's comprehension. It's led by the only person who really matters. You. So here's the takeaway. You don't need everyone to understand you. You don't need every question answered or every motive validated. The only thing that matters is that you understand yourself. Today, instead of over-explaining why you're choosing a certain project or task, I will focus on taking the action that matters most. Today, instead of pausing to justify my timing or my approach to someone else, I will move forward according to my own plan. Today, instead of editing my decisions to make them easier to digest for others, I will make them clean, sharp, and aligned with what I actually want. Today, instead of worrying whether anyone will get my reasoning, I will trust my judgment and take the step that feels right. Today, instead of holding back on a choice because someone might question it, I will act anyway. Today, instead of shrinking my perspective to fit what someone else can handle, I will think big and act bold. Every step you take without waiting for approval, every choice you make without over-explaining, is a step closer to living life on your own terms. That's where momentum, confidence, and real clarity come from. And here's the subtle shift most people never notice. The moment you stop performing for understanding, you stop chasing validation, and everything else starts to line up almost effortlessly. So take that step. Trust your reasoning. Move forward even if no one else sees it yet.